Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring the challenges of mental health and how it can be both a driver of astonishing creativity, but also the cause of huge amounts of pain. Having conversations about mental health is, I think, really important if we want to create an inclusive society and get the best out of everyone. And to do that, on this episode, I'm joined by the incredibly talented Matt Ottley. He's an author, illustrator, composer, and musician whose work spans multiple mediums and touches on profound themes. Matt's journey as a creative artist has been shaped in large part by his experiences with type 1 bipolar disorder, which has given him a unique and sometimes challenging perspective on creativity and mental health. In our discussion, we explore how Matt's mental health has influenced his artistic process, how he navigates the extreme highs and lows that come with bipolar disorder, and how these experiences have culminated in his latest work, The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness. This project is unlike anything I've encountered before. It's not just a book, it's a multimedia exploration of psychosis and recovery, blending music, art, and storytelling to give a visceral understanding of what it means to live with bipolar disorder. And Matt has been kind enough to give me permission to use his music on the show, so you'll not only hear from him, but you'll also hear some of that as well. Whether you're interested in the intersections of art and mental health, curious about how neurodiversity shapes creativity, or simply want to hear an inspiring story from someone who's channeled personal challenges into extraordinary work, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. It's my discussion with Matt Ottley on neurodiversity and creativity. Matt, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hi, Christian. Thank you for having me on the podcast. This is going to be an interesting conversation. I love the title, the Human Risk podcast.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled that you're here because I think you represent so many things that I am curious and want to understand more about. So I'm delighted that you're sparing the time to be with us. I guess to start us off, Matt, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself as a pen portrait as to who you are?
Okay. Well, I suppose the best place to start is a simple kind of biography, really. I was born in the Central Highlands of Papua New Guinea in the early 60s, when for the Australians that were in New Guinea, it was very much frontier country. So I was in that space where Australian patrol officers were still making first contact with Indigenous people who had no idea that there was an outside world. So it was a very interesting place to be brought up as a child. As a 12-year-old, my family and I moved to Australia, which I found incredibly challenging, even though ostensibly I'm an Australian citizen. It was not my home country. And I had a few issues adapting to the culture, and went on to follow the earlier footsteps of the men in my family, my father and my uncles. I went and worked on some of the vast cattle stations that are in the outback of Australia before going on to study visual arts and music. And after many other kinds of occupation, I eventually, at the age of 30, arrived at working as a full-time author, illustrator, and as a musician. I've been a professional flamenco and classical guitarist. I'm currently working as an orchestral composer, along with my work as an author and illustrator. So that's kind of a very, very potted history.
Wow. And the bit that I love there is it's such a fascinating background. And I'm always incredibly intrigued by people that are creative and artistic. And you combine lots of things in one. So you're not just talented in art, you're also a musician. How did you just discover that? Did you know from an early age that that's where your destiny was? Was your talent obvious, or was that something that came out later in life?
I think it was fairly obvious, but I didn't follow the trajectory that normal children do, in that, age sort of 3, 4, 5, 6, when children are sort of beginning to show the ability to represent shapes, people, houses, whatever in their drawings. You can sort of see a rudimentary understanding visually of the world around them. I was unable to do that. My drawings up till I was about 7 were more or less completely abstract. I couldn't get concepts. I couldn't understand the way that other children were visually interpreting the world. And I had no idea why I kept getting in trouble with my teachers, because I just could not do things. Then suddenly, at about the age of 8, something switched on, and I went from having, I guess, an almost like an autistic approach to concepts and to understandings, to being sort of years ahead of all of my peers. My drawings suddenly happened, and by the time I was sort of 9, 10 years old, I was drawing more like an adult. And so I'm not sure exactly what processes were going on there. I am neurodiverse. I have type 1 bipolar disorder, which emerged quite young. I first started having experiences like that when I was 9 years old. And whether that's something to do with it, I don't know. But from about the age of, yeah, 7, 8, 9, had suddenly all this ability to be able to draw. I suddenly had a fairly advanced concept of language as well. And music suddenly started happening for me. So kind of from that age on, it was pretty obvious that I was going to find my way eventually somewhere within the creative arts. It was a very long circuitous route to get there because of my mental health situation, but also because of the family I come from, which is a whole other story.
I'm intrigued by this sort of sudden appearance of the talent, because it almost, if I'm trying to visualize this in my mind, I've got a sense of you're doing something completely different, possibly sort of you look like you're not conforming, you're not delivering anything, maybe not taking this seriously. I could see how an education system that might not understand, you'd be looked at sort of almost as if you're messing around. And then suddenly you're turbocharged, almost light years ahead. Is that kind of how it feels? Because it's a really interesting thing to me that I can see how somebody could not be able to complete the exercises as requested, and that would always be an issue. But you're talking about something really interesting, which is sort of disengaged from the process because it's not working for you. And then all of a sudden, whoosh, like light years pass by, and you're suddenly at a very advanced state. I mean, that did it feel like suddenly you were connecting with it, or did you not? Was it other people that noticed that shift, or did you suddenly feel that what you were doing was being accepted? I guess what I'm trying to get to is I'm trying to understand whether for you did it feel like a sort of sudden turbocharge, or was it a natural progression? And was it just for other people that there was a big shift?
No, I think for me, it felt like a shift as well, a sudden shift. Suddenly things started sliding into place. I can actually remember the very day it happened. I was sitting in the playground of the schoolhouse where we were in Papua New Guinea, and I had a lump of plasticine, and I started making, of all things, an elephant. Now, I'd only ever seen elephants in photographs because obviously in the highlands of New Guinea, there was no chance of ever seeing a real elephant. But I remember squeezing out the ears and the trunk and suddenly and modeling the head. And suddenly I just had this idea that, oh, that's the way it goes. I have no idea where it came from. And from that moment on, the same thing happened in my drawing. I was suddenly drawing perspective, the way that kids don't do. I was suddenly drawing people that have necks and shoulders and joints, and they weren't just sort of stick people. And so, look, I do have my theories on it, and I've spoken with psychiatrists about it because bipolar is partly a genetic condition, and I have type 1 bipolar disorder, which is the more severe version of the condition. And it's pretty well recognized that bipolar disorder is associated with higher levels of creativity. There's a much higher level of bipolar disorder within the professional arts community worldwide than in the rest of the community. I can't remember what the percentages are, but it's something like in Australia, 11% of the professional arts community has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So it's definitely associated with higher levels of creativity. But the thing is, the genes for the condition need to be switched on. And around about that age was when I suffered some fairly extreme childhood trauma, which would have switched the genes for bipolar on and probably switched on that part of the brain that is able to conceive of abstract conceptions and, is, in other words, the whole creative part of the brain suddenly lit up with those genes being switched on. That's what I put it down to. Now, of course, there's been no case studies in exactly this area of the condition of bipolar, is when it gets switched on and how that changes the cognitive abilities of a person. Not that I'm aware of anyway, but that's what I think happened.
Absolutely fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about, for people that are unfamiliar with bipolar, how does that manifest itself in terms of your decision making and how you perceive the world?
Well, there are a few different forms of bipolar, but roughly there are two major forms, the type 1 and type 2. Then there are a lot of variants within that. Type 2 is the common form where it's basically, it's called a mood disorder because you have elevated moods where you suddenly find that you need less sleep. You don't want less sleep. Your speech tends to speed up. Your thinking speeds up. You can become a little delusional about your own abilities. So, people will stretch themselves financially and get into all sorts of trouble because they're convinced that, that if they make this investment, it's just going to work and they're going to suddenly make a lot of money, or they'll take risky decisions about things. You can sort of fall in love with everybody. Suddenly everyone around you just becomes the most wonderful human being, and you just want to embrace them the whole time, and you just think that humanity is absolutely wonderful. But people who naturally are a bit irascible, they get easily irritated in that hypermanic state. They can become very annoyed, very irascible. So when psychiatrists talk about this being an elevated mood, elevated both can be positive, but it can also be negative. Thankfully, I'm the sort of person that just tends to fall in love with the world, and I have a lot of sudden creative ideas and just want to start a whole heap of new projects. And so you get very buzzy. Inevitably what happens though is then you have a crash. And so the hypermanic phase can last a few weeks. It generally is not very long. It's generally, a few days to a week. And then you'll have a crash, and that can be weeks and weeks, if not months, of the most deadening depression. And that's where the illness becomes dangerous. That's type 2. I have type 1, which means that the hypermanic episodes can become full-blown mania, which means they can last a lot longer, and you can become delusional and psychotic as well. So you can hear things, that you hear voices, you see things that are not there. And in my experience, that speeded up thinking becomes so fast that you lose control of it. That internal dialogue, monologue that's always going on inside our heads, that becomes so fast that you can't keep up with it. And sometimes it starts tripping over itself. So I will hear multiple versions of my own voice in my head. And then the depressive aspect is pretty much the same as type 2. The only difference is you can also become psychotic when you're depressed as well. Now, there's a further complication in that some people in both types 1 and type 2 bipolar have what are called mixed episodes. So it's where you are manic and depressed at the same time. So your brain is speeding, your mind is supercharged, and you're deeply, deeply depressed as well. And that's a very, very distressing state to be in.
And so the link to the creativity is, I guess, all of these things are extreme emotions from what you've talked about, and therefore we kind of all know that interesting ideas occur. I guess it's sort of like anything else is put a bit of pressure on something or a stimulus behind it, and interesting things will happen. And so, really, I guess what you're talking about, the creative side, from what I can sense and what I've read, is that really, because you're going through these extreme emotions, it's in a way not surprising that there's a lot of creative output from that. Is that your experience?
Yeah, there is also a physiological aspect in that when most people who don't have bipolar are being creative, if you could see their brain and the way the neurons are lighting up, you'd see sort of random connections here and there, but you'd almost see a track across a person's brain as ideas are happening. With the bipolar brain, when it's episodic, when creative ideas are happening, you see the areas of the brain lighting up from all over the place. So your brain is making random synaptic connections that it wouldn't normally do. So, for example, um, if I'm writing a piece of orchestral music and I can remember being in that state and writing music, and suddenly, I'm writing a piece of sort of orchestral music playing with standard orchestral instruments, and suddenly this idea that, oh, I need to get the sound of trees rustling in here. It's got nothing to do with the theme of the piece of music. It just seemed at the time like a good idea. That's a different part of the brain just lighting up and going, well, you got to throw that in. And then you apply your sort of uh, cognitive processes, and you can make that idea work, and it can be really interesting. If the mania gets kind of too far and it's becoming delusional, that's when your ideas start actually becoming loopy, and they're not going to work. But there is a moment just before that time where you are making random connections between things that can be really interesting. And that's where the heightened creativity comes from, because in any normal state, your brain is not really capable of making that kind of random connection. But I should say that one thing I will always talk about, particularly if I'm talking to young people, is that this illness is a killer. So, yes, it can lead to the most extraordinary creativity, but you do pay a very, very high price for that. I've spoken with lots of psychiatrists, and I have had a lot of psychiatrists in my life, and a lot of them regard bipolar, particularly type 1 bipolar disorder, as a potentially terminal illness because there is such a high suicide rate. Because, for two reasons. One, the depth of depression that people find themselves in, and there is no talking therapy that can get you out of that. That's science is in a place at the moment where it doesn't really understand these kind of neurological conditions. And so the medicines that are given, they do tend to work, but generally they're medicines that were developed for other things. And it's just been found that they work for mood disorders as well. But they come with pretty severe side effects, and they don't work universally for everybody. So, some people, regardless of taking medication, just can't be brought out of those really, really severe states of depression. And the other thing is often people take massive risks when they're hypermanic or manic. And as you're coming out of that and going into depression, there is the most extraordinary sense of shame that you can have, and that's because um, part of that heightened um, state of being that you're in means you have heightened sexuality as well. So people will often get themselves into all sorts of trouble in their sex lives when they're manic. They get into financial issues, and coming out of that, people often feel such deep shame and feel that they are just unable to control their lives. That's where this illness becomes a killer and becomes very dangerous. So I always like, if we're talking about the creative side of the illness, which can be quite extraordinary, needs to be balanced with a conversation about the dark side of the illness as well.
Thank you for that. That's one of the clearest explanations I've ever had, and the real sense of it being a roller coaster that's beyond your control, I guess. And so what's interesting for me is it's not you don't have the ability, I'm guessing, to you reach that point of a creative genius, should we say? You can't just stop it there, right? You're not really in control of what's happening in that sense. So it could stop there. It could go further than that. And so this is, I guess, it's sort of untamable, really. And how does this feel in terms of you? Does it feel like something else is controlling you? Have you got any sense of loss of control? How does that work?
Yeah, well, in fact, that my latest work, The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness, which is a metaphorical journey through a psychotic episode, but done in a way that I hope, because it's an artwork, it's a work of music, literature, and visual art. It's safe. People can be immersed in what psychosis is like, but it's done in a very sort of metaphorical Alice in Wonderland like way. So it's safe. So they're going to come out the other side and be okay. But yeah, the inspiration for that work did actually come from a severe psychotic episode I had, where I did actually feel like there was an external force controlling me, that something was growing inside of me and it was taking me over, and it had got to my brain. I felt it was it, it was like a mycelium, like a mushroom. It was some sort of alien force. You know, I could actually see it moving under my skin. That's the way psychosis works. You see things as well as hear and feel things. And I felt that it had been growing in for me for some time, and and my life was no longer my own. Um, and it actually led to a very, very severe suicide attempt, a near miss, if you like. I had a near death experience. I ended up on life support, and it was a very, very serious, very dark, and very long period of my life. That period, that was a result of a very, very bad episode. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, I should also say that the medications do actually stabilize people. They do keep people well. So I don't want to give the impression that people's lives are always completely out of control. If you're one of the lucky people for whom a drug like lithium really works and works well, then so long as you manage your life and manage the medication, you can be okay. There are some people like me for whom medications are just a nightmare. I carry two genes called the MTHFR gene which a lot of the population carries. If you happen to have an illness like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, then carrying that gene means that possibly medications can be a nightmare because their medicative effect is lessened, but their side effects are heightened. So, for example, there's an antipsychotic I take called olanzapine, which is a common antipsychotic, and it really works. It really works well for me. But if I take it for a long period of time, I end up with quite severe body spasms. So, for example, at those times, I'm not confident to drink liquid out of a glass because I'm not sure that my jaw's suddenly going to spasm and I actually need to take a bite out of the glass, and I'll have all of these quite severe seizure like spasms that will go on for hours at a time. So that's a side effect. That's actually a common side effect of antipsychotics, long term use of antipsychotics. It's normally quite minimal, but for people like me who carry this particular gene, it can be quite elevated, the side effects. So for people like me, the medications are a nightmare. I do take them, they work, but it's always a balancing act. It's that, life is just one constant management issue.
And I presume there's a huge degree of experimentation required to see what works and what doesn't. So you will have had, I'm guessing, decades of trying different things. And your point is that because the drugs aren't designed for this because they don't work in the same way for everybody. I'm assuming there's just a huge degree of we just have to try things and see what it does for you, Matt. And so that must be another interesting sense of we're trying to control something that feels like a roller coaster ride, and then we're trying something that it's not a guaranteed solution. So that in of itself, I guess, is another second roller coaster
Oh,
ride.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, when you're first diagnosed, psychiatrists will say to you, and of course, this is duty of care. They'll say, look, this is treatable. We will find a solution for you. If they're really honest, they'll say, we'll start off with a drug like lithium and maybe an antidepressant. And if you are showing signs of psychosis, an antipsychotic as well. And you'll gradually be sort of what's the word, titrated onto clinical levels of those drugs. And they'll say, hopefully that will work for you. If it doesn't, you then have to go through the process of weaning yourself off those drugs and trying a new set of drugs. And you're absolutely right. I've been through decades of trying every known medication for bipolar disorder. I do have a management system now that works for me. And it's sort of partly pharmaceutical, partly allied health related. So alternative medicine related, and just plain good, sensible life management decisions. Regular sleep. I can't be subjected to flashing lights because that can trigger mania, or sudden loud noises, which is really interesting for a orchestral composer because orchestras are loud.
Right.
So, and regular sleep. Sleep is the main thing. Anyone with a complex mental illness will have sleep issues. So that's a big one, getting your sleep management, sleep hygiene right. So I finally sort of found that. I'm in the most wonderful, stable relationship, which helps a lot as well. My partner is both my business manager, and when I'm unwell, she's my carer as well. But I've been relatively healthy for a decade now with just minor episodes. I've had a couple of minor psychotic episodes, but it's all been very manageable. It isn't like my earlier life where I was a completely unguided missile.
And so if we think about your career is obviously creative. And so in some respects, you could say one brings out the best in what you can do, and is a natural talent that you have. But I guess also allows you the latitude to be able to manage your life a bit more effectively. If somebody were doing a more traditional career, conventional career, should we say, this is a lot more challenging. If you have to go to an office every single day and manage that, that's got to be quite challenging. So in a way, you've, I guess, created an environment that works for you, and that's I'm assuming a physical
Yeah.
environment, a business environment, creative environment that allows you to manage those things. For people that aren't able to do that, I'm assuming this must be incredibly difficult, because sticking to routines that other people might think are simple and normal is just difficult for them. And so really what one is looking at I guess this isn't just about take some pills and solve the problem. This is, we have to structure, if we want to cater for the challenges that people face and to get the best out of them, and also to mitigate the risks that they might pose to themselves and to society, we really have to start thinking about creating environments that can allow this to be managed and allow them to
Yeah,
flourish.
that is a really good point. One of the areas that I am interested in is stigma. But there's a lot of stigmatization that goes under the radar because of the systems in which we live and the way work life structures are within our society is one of those. I had a psychiatrist who said that he always wondered why bipolar disorder is still within humanity, because it's described over 2,000 years ago. Forensic psychiatrists can see that what was being talked about in ancient Greece for particular people was in fact bipolar disorder. And so his idea was that obviously nature hasn't kind of leached it out of the whole human out of human evolution, because it must be serving some purpose. And his thought was that it does bring incredible lateral thinking to society. And so what you're saying is really important. There are a lot of neurodiverse people who could be making the most extraordinary contributions to society just because of the way they think, but they can't, because work structures are exactly as you've said. They're constructed so that people who have conditions like mine just simply can't partake. We can't have 9 to 5 jobs. We would not be reliable. And yet there's a lot of intellectual prowess that could be contributing. So I'm not sure how we get around that one, but talking about it is the first space. So probably that's one of the most important things for me that you've brought up in this podcast. So thank you for that.
Well, I find this fascinating because as you were talking, I was thinking there's a ton of problems, whether we talk about climate or inequality, societal challenges, stuff the species has got to sort out, or we're heading for all sorts of trouble. And therefore, we do need that lateral thinking, that creative thinking. And I guess the challenge is the perceived inability to conform. It shuts you out. You're not in the room because you sort of think, well, this person seems unreliable, or I don't quite know what they're about. And it's precisely that it gives you the creative ability to think differently. But it's precisely that shuts you out of certain discussions and certain roles. And so it's interesting because almost in the not fitting in piece, you're demonstrating that you have the capability of approaching the world very differently. So it's an advertisement for this is I am capable of thinking because I behave slightly differently. I do things, but of course people don't like that because it feels non-conformist and rebellious and unpredictable and all these sort of negative. So I think there's something really interesting there, which is we all like a little bit of radical thinking and we want radical solutions to problems. And yet, if you can't conform, you're never allowed to present those radical
Yeah,
solutions.
yeah, well put. Absolutely well put. And I think that is just going to come down to education, educating people that, hey, this person is in the room. They're not going to have some of the normal, they're not going to operate by some of the normal social etiquettes, so if they say things or do things that appears a little offensive, just step back and try and understand. There's nothing personal going on here. It's just this person's perceiving things a little differently to you, and their understanding of relationships and being able to read people and what's going on between people is a little different. But yeah, within that difference, they can sometimes see clearly solutions to problems that other people can't see. And, it always distresses me the amount of intellectual wastage that happens within our society because people of neurodiversity just can't play the game.
And I think that's a brilliant way of phrasing it. I think it is fundamentally it is a game, and a lot of the rules and processes and almost things that aren't written down, social norms, the way we do things point to that. And I guess it's very tribal in a sense. And so we like the tribe, the average person wants the tribe to behave in a particular way, and we've for centuries have ostracized people that kind of do things that seem odd or unusual or don't fit our normal expectations. And so I think there's something innate in the human psyche that drives us towards that. But I think what you're pointing to nicely there is to sort of say, actually, we should view I love the bit about Mother Nature. This is a feature, and it's often perceived as a bug. And I think if we could turn this much more into how do we get the best out of this potential, and how can we tap into that resource? And actually, we should be finding roles for people that don't require them to conform all the time. There's no point in putting someone in a position that they're just never going to be capable of
Mm,
fulfilling. But there will be other things that they can do. And for me, this points towards very much around job crafting and how we think about. I mean, it's ironic, really, the word human resources, because often we ignore the human bit and we're not looking at the actual resources
yeah.
that are there and the capabilities
Yeah,
they have.
absolutely. And as you say, it's about crafting, so someone who has an extraordinary lateral thinking ability and can look at an issue and have lots of simultaneous things going on in their brain processing at the same time and may not completely understand themselves what is going on. So, I have synesthesia, and I know I don't have the synesthesia associated with numbers, but speaking with people that have synesthesia that are mathematicians, they'll talk about seeing shapes in their mind and seeing a second shape in their mind, which each represents a number. And when the two shapes are joined together, they immediately know what that additional number is, even though they haven't done the actual math. It's all been about what the shape looks like. So, crafting a job where someone can come in and just spend whatever time is needed to add to a team to solve problems, for example, but isn't expected to be there 9 to 5 because they're not going to cope. So yeah, job crafting is the way forward, I think. There are better brains than me to figure out how we can go about doing that, though.
I almost think it's not really it's not your problem to solve, because you're not the one. You wouldn't design the world in this way. And so I think one of the things we have to recognize is that those of us who are able to condition ourselves in the ways that that society expects, I think it's incumbent on us to drive that change, because it's very difficult if you're not part of that process and you struggle with that process. You're going to find what works for you, and of course you should be part of that thing. But I think to work out how we dismantle where we're at seems to me should be the people who are perpetuating it, for whom it is normal. It's probably more of our job to work out how to unpick that and then bridge that gap, as opposed to saying, not only are you struggling to fit into our expectations, but actually you should also be responsible for redesigning it. I think it's a
Yeah,
collaboration, but I think that starts with the people that are within it, the people that are comfortable in that work, because otherwise we're never going to make any change. Otherwise it's change on one side. I think we need to be a bit more sophisticated
yeah,
about that.
absolutely. And I think that's because the people who design workforces and design work flows and working hours and the way offices are structured, et cetera, they're part of that equation, which is nowadays spoken about, but traditionally probably not, is socializations. It's about the social aspects of people. And people who are neurodiverse don't fit the normal social models. So yeah, it's a really hard ask, asking someone who's neurodiverse to redesign a workforce, because we don't know how other people think and how they work together socially as units, but you do. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Thank you for all of that incredibly powerful and helpful discussion, because I think that really frames what you've produced with the book. And I think calling it a book isn't right at all, because it's writing, it's beautiful art, it's music. Just talk a little bit about the format of what you've done here, because this isn't just one medium, for want of a phrase. This is multimodal stuff. How did you come up with that format?
Um, well, it, it's kind of always the way that I've thought. So, for example, this project began, oh gosh, back in, I don't know, now I have written it down somewhere, but it was somewhere in the mid 2000, 2008, 2009, sometime around then. I was very unwell, and something that has occasionally happened to me when I've been psychotic is I lose the ability to understand spoken language. I can hear the voice in my head and understand it, but what comes out of other people's mouths is just gobbledygook. But my condition of synesthesia is really heightened. So when they speak, I just hear these random sounds, but I see the most beautiful colors and shapes sort of swirling around their heads. And at that state as well, I can hear music in my head with absolute crystal clarity, and it almost becomes externalized. So I'll take, say, a musical phrase, and I can sort of see it in front of me, and I know how to harmonize it because I can see a shape that I can fit underneath it or above it, and depending on how they combine, I know it's going to work. So um, I kind of almost start seeing this musical landscape in the physical world around me. And during that particularly severe bout of illness, I just stayed in the room that I was in because I couldn't understand what people were saying. And I just started writing music. And it wasn't for this particular project. I started writing what was going to be a symphony, but it's just the sounds that were coming to me. Now, I wrote about 5 minutes of that, and then I became well. That obviously not, it took me a while to write 5 minutes of music, but I stopped there because I got well and I got on with my life. And then years later, I had another severe episode, the one in which I felt something was growing inside of me. And as part of my recovery process, I kept a journal. I always kept a journal while I was recovering, in hospital and outside of hospital, in which I just wrote stuff down. And that included a lot of poetry. And it was about sometime after 2010, 2012, 13, sometime around then, I was talking to a friend of mine who was an editor, a person I'd worked with for years and years, and was talking about this recovery journal and the poetry. And she said, "Oh, would you mind showing me something?" So I showed her this poem, which was called The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness. And it was about that particular episode I'd had. And she said, "You know, this would make a great picture book for adults and young adults." And that really was the birth of this book. And I knew then that I wanted people to be able to experience the thing in a way that just words and images were not going to show them. It needed music as well. So I thought, well, I'll go back and use that piece of music I'd started writing, because it truly reflects my unwell mind, because I was very unwell when I wrote it. And so that became the overture for the 50-minute symphony, choral symphony, which is part of this work. So it sort of all happened organically, but because I whenever I'm doing a painting, I'm often kind of hearing the sounds that might go with the visual images. The only time that doesn't happen is if I deliberately turn music on while I'm painting. That can actually affect the way I paint then. It can affect the way colors and shapes work in the painting. So I love doing that, but sometimes I have to be careful about how I do that. So all of my work tends to be an amalgam of all things. So I will use music. So I'll write, if I want to know what the face of a character it is, for example, in a book, I might write a piece of music that is how I feel about their personality. Then I'll take the melody lines, take them off the music stave, put them on a drawing paper, and turn those melody lines into the shapes of their faces. And that's how I'll create the faces of characters. And I'll work the other way as well. I'll take drawings and I'll take lines from the drawings and put them on music staves and put notes on that line and turn them into melodies, and take other lines from drawings and create the harmonies. And so it becomes a piece of music. And I'm continually working backwards and forwards like that. I've coined the term intermodal rather than multimodal because the construction of each creative mode is so intertwined with that of the others. Where the music leaves off imagery being an image, and where an image becomes a bit of music is sort of in my brain, it's also enmeshed. I don't know where one begins and one ends, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, and I think it's a brilliant combining what we were talking about before with this and the creative processes that you talk about. Makes absolutely perfect sense that you would produce something that was again, what I love, because the question I was going to ask you was how would you describe this, and I think it's because it's to call it a book would be
Yeah,
wrong. It is just it's all of these things in one. And so I just thought it's really interesting way that you're not allowing the work to be defined by just that one thing. Just to read or look at the art wouldn't give you the sense. You need the words as well, but then the music adds something else. And of course you can pick those pieces independently, but the totality of what you're doing is cutting across those genres. And so I really like that, the fact that the way you describe it, but also that you can consume the separate parts, but the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And so we have to look at those things. So it makes absolutely perfect sense. And I think it's a really interesting idea because often as I think about formats nowadays, you might have somebody releasing things on different formats, but it tends to be a sort of derivative of the same thing. And what you're really doing is intertwining these things and saying there isn't really a point where, yes, they deliver to you in a different mechanism, but there isn't really a point. There's no dividing line here. This all sits together as one thing.
absolutely. Yeah. And what I was talking about is working process, but thematically as well, metaphorically, it's exactly what you're saying. So, for example, there's one part of the book where the boy has become a young man and the medicine has stopped working for him. So this tree that is growing inside of him, whose flower is ecstasy, but whose fruit is unbearable sadness, he he just stands back and basically surrenders to it, and this thing grows from within out. So you see it growing through his eyes and out his nose and mouth, and it encases him. He becomes the tree that was inside of him. It's now completely encases him, and his mind is released. So this is metaphorically the beginning of psychosis. His mind is going somewhere else. But at that point, the words simply say that the medicine has stopped working. The picture, the image in the book shows us the horror of what's happening to him because they're quite horrific drawings. I made them deliberately disturbing. The music at that point is a fugue. Now, I don't know if you know what a fugue is, but if you think of,
I do, but explain it to my listeners in
yeah, well,
case they
you,
don't.
you remember the rounds we used to sing as children, the nursery song rounds like row, 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 row your boat gently down the stream, and someone else comes in. Now they're designed so it really wouldn't matter where you kind of come in, the second voice, the third voice, all combined is going to create beautiful harmonies, and you get this melody that is overlapping. that's strictly, it's a simple canon, but that's what it's called. But it's part of this style of writing music, which is called fugue. Now, in a fugue proper, a melody develops and each iteration of it also develops. So you get very complex music happening. The most complex, the biggest fugue until now in Western European music is J.S. Bach's 7-part fugue from his B minor mass. So that has 7 parts that are all iterations of the same melody, but all sort of swirling around each other and creating this really rich music. I decided to go for broke and wrote a 68-part fugue because I knew that the fugal form wouldn't stand up. It would just become cacophony. And I discovered after about 9 voices, for anyone who's musical out there, this is different from a motet. A motet, you can have many more different melodies operating, but you can design each melody so that harmonically they all work together. A fugue, the melody is basically got to be the same or very similar. And so when you have it overlapping, coming in at different parts, you can get to about 8 or 9 versions of it and it just starts becoming harmonically a mess. So I wrote a 68-part fugue, which I believe is probably now the biggest fugue in Western music history, but it's just a cacophony, and it's meant to be. It just becomes this swirling vortex of a sound that represents the multiple voices and the noise in the character's head. So the images can't show you that, the words can't tell you that, the music can. And all three combined give you the full picture of what this boy is experiencing. So it's exactly as you say. It's kind of, it's all enmeshed, and you can just read the book on its own and hopefully it makes sense. You can listen to the music on its own, hopefully it makes sense. But combined, they give the full picture. But I've also turned it into a cinema film as well. It's a 50-minute film, which we're finding is the way people really can experience all the aspects of the work together in a truly immersive way, because, with surround sound and all of the images on a very big screen, we're getting amazing feedback from people who watch the film. And of course, then they go back and receive the book in a different way as well, because they can sort of see why it is now all meant to be experienced together, because the film has given them that.
I love this, and I love the just thinking through all the fact that you're bringing all the different senses to play, I think is fascinating, and I think is a great way of manifesting the dynamics here, because the way you've talked about what you go through is it's very, it's all encompassing. And so I love the fact that you've taken that and really said the only way I can tell this story's the wrong word, because it is based on your experience, but it's not you're not the
Yeah,
main protagonist in this, but yet this is talking about your tale, but you're taking some of the, I guess, the visceral nature of what you
yeah,
go through. And that's a really powerful use of different medium to transmit that.
yeah. And visceral, I'm glad you used that word, because there's a lot of allusion to visceral, to viscera in the images. So the boy's mind leaves his body and it travels to this sort of surreal, fantastic place. Like I said, it's a sort of an Alice in Wonderland like place. He comes to sort of the heart of this place, which is called here. And that's because, when you're in a psychotic episode, that the rest of the world doesn't exist. All that exists for you is the reality that you're experiencing right there and then. So he's in this place, he comes to the heart of it and meets a sovereign. And she claims that, she is the ruler of everything. She is it. There is nothing else but her and here that she rules over. And she is, I chose deliberately a female character for this sovereign because the protagonist is male. But there is also reference, the whole story is told in a sort of a traditional fable style. So she is that, she's takes that space in some traditional fables where the crone figure is really mixed. It's both a negative, sometimes evil influence, but a crone can also be a healer. The crone figure in a lot of traditional fables is the pivot to change. So I chose the sovereign as the sort of traditional crone figure, but she also represents that completely egocentric persona that is at the heart of psychosis. I was going to make her an infant, a baby, because, babies are completely egocentric. They have to be for survival. But I thought, no, I'm going to stick to traditional fable storytelling because that has a very powerful place in the history of storytelling. But when you see her full body, there's a curtain in her palace and you see the sort of torso of her and she is this regal figure. But behind the curtain, she's got this massive, massive bloated body that is transparent and you can see all her viscera. It's massive. It's sort of meters, hundreds of meters long. And it's just this roiling pile of guts. And partly I chose that deliberately because I do want people to feel this at a visceral level. So there's a bit of sort of me visually directing people how to feel there, if you like. I don't know what that sounds like, but I want people to feel viscerally this story, hence the imagery of viscera.
Wow. And this is all amazing. I'm assuming that the book is obviously designed for people that have similar experiences to you as a sort of, you're not alone, this is how this works. But it's also, I guess, for people like me, so that we can have an understanding of what you go through and the experiences that you have. And therefore, it's really, I guess it's on the one hand, an explainer for people like me. On the other hand, a comfort blanket, a reassurer, I guess, for people that are growing up with similar challenges that you faced. Is that the right way to look
Yeah,
at it?
yeah. I did. I did the work initially because having experienced a lot of stigma myself and just seeing the blank looks on people's faces, they just don't understand. I wanted to do something that was going to raise the level of empathy. You know, uh, I think it's unfortunately very true with us humans that unless we've experienced something ourselves, we kind of don't get what other people are going through. But I think in one sense, we are divine creatures. We have the ability, we have the insight. We are extraordinary beings. We can be able to reach each other and to really feel each other. And I just felt that so strongly that I wanted to create a work that would reach into other people and give them a felt experience, a safe one, but a felt experience, simply so that, well, the words that the tenor sings is in one of the choral sections. There's a solo tenor, and he basically sings, for 1,000 years I have railed in fear, cast a light on those that I have thrown stones upon. It's about not treating people who are neurodivergent as lepers in that biblical sense, as outcasts, but having a simple human kindness. The example I often give is if someone has a severely broken leg, like they've just broken their leg, and you rush to them to help, and you touch them, and that your touch causes exquisite pain, they'll snap at you. They might yell at you, but you're not afraid of that because you understand where it comes from. You're totally not afraid of it. Oh, sorry, what can I do to help? Someone who's in severe psychiatric pain does the same thing, but we're afraid of them because we can't see the broken leg. We can't see what's broken. So we have this fear of them, but we needn't. Statistically, we needn't. Psychotic people are not the danger that Hollywood has made them out to be. Most psychotic people are not violent people.
It's interesting, as you're talking, this is all for me. This is all about empathy and recognizing there's stuff going on that you don't know about. And so having a bit of insight into what that stuff might be is I think, going to be helpful. Because one of the things you often hear for people, they talk about sort of, oh, it wasn't like this in my day, what all these 21st century illnesses. And there's a slight sneering. And the response is generally sort of, oh, just snap out of it, right? You're being self-indulgent or whatever. And so what you're really trying to say is that this stuff is real. This is real lived experience. I'm going to present it to you in a way that, is accessible, because I don't want you to go through these extremities, and you probably wouldn't get published, I guess, if you were to push it because there's a risk in doing that. But it's really just around saying this is real, and I'd like you to step into my world a little bit so that you can have more of an understanding about what might be going on, to make you more empathetic to those
Yeah.
around you.
Yep. Beautifully put. Yeah. Yeah. Really beautifully put.
And so, logically, Matt, your job is not done with this stuff. I'm guessing your mind is racing. What's the? And I recognise this is a labour of love that's taken some time, as you explained. There must be lots of other things going on in your head. Have you got a sense of what the next project is?
Yeah. I've just started working on the fourth movement of another big choral symphony, which is about warfare. It's not a militaristic work. It's a meditation on generational trauma and anger. In my research, I've gone back 13,000 years to some of the earliest archaeological evidence of organized military campaigns. And so it seems to me we have, as human beings, we have 13,000 years of trauma piled upon trauma, piled upon trauma, which leads to anger, piled upon anger, piled upon anger. And you throw into that the, how can I put it, the inability of a lot of the world's religious congregations, and I'm talking about, lots of different kinds of belief systems, to accept that maybe, just maybe, they don't have a handle on the truth. That the truth is in there somewhere, but rigidity of thinking is not going to lead us to it. You throw that into the mix along with generational anger, generational dysfunctional patriarchal societies, and we have the recipe that we're witnessing year in, year out, which is ongoing warfare. And again, I don't know, I just have this feeling deep in my gut that we are such sublime beings. We are capable of so much better. And so all I can do as an artist is just put my voice out there, and hopefully people will listen and it will start conversations. And I guess everything that I do, looking back at my work, is about us humans being gentler, being kinder. And that means facing some fairly challenging notion. So, for example, one of the movements in this new symphony it has as its central theme the idea of competitive sport. The way we approach competitive sport, I pose the question, are we venting territorial imperatives, tribal imperatives, and coming away healthier? Or are we actually nurturing warfare? That's the question that's not ever asked. And I think it's a very valid question. And it's just one of the many things that needs to go into the mix to creating a gentler, kinder world. So that's one of the projects I'm working on.
I've no doubt we could keep talking forever, Matt, to discover what the other ones are. But that was a wonderful insight, and I love the way you're fusing lots of things there in a really interesting way to ask some fundamental questions. Thank you so much for sparing the time, because I've learned there's so many things I've learned, so many things that have got me reflecting and thinking about things. Congratulations on, I will call it the book, but you
Yeah.
know what I mean. It's an absolute triumph, really engaging, and I think will help a lot of people, and is beautifully done. And as people will have detected, it's got your heart and soul in it. And thank you so much for opening that up, to being so transparent and honest with us, and being not only producing a fabulous work, but also being a fantastic guest on the show. Before I let you go, remind people what the book is called.
It's called The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness. It's published by One Tentacle Publishing, and it's available in the UK. It's just been released, and we are going to have another screening in the UK in October at the London's City Lit Mental Wealth Festival. There will be another screening of the film of The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Amazing. What I might do, Matt, is ask you to send me details of anyone else, because we have listeners throughout the world on this show. So there are quite a lot in the UK, so that's helpful. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes, but anything else that you've got, we'll add into the show notes as well. And there'll be links to the book and your website and everything else. But thank you so much for spending the time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Christian. It's been really lovely talking with you.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and to Matt for appearing. To find out more about Matt, his latest multimedia project, The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness, and the film tour that he mentioned, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you. Welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Let's see if we can all create a little bit more empathy towards those who think differently, because you never know, their ideas might lead to some really profound changes. But above all, thank you so much for listening. I'll leave you with a little bit more of the music from Matt's audio version of The Tree of Ecstasy and Unbearable Sadness.